Now, the Christian tradition is interesting on this because until the turn of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, the Christian tradition held that God in God's self, or God in himself, if you like, couldn't have feelings, couldn't have emotions, was what gets called impassible. And in fact, it was a heresy to think that God in God's self could have emotions. It was called patripassianism or theopassianism. And that may seem a surprise to a lot of people who are familiar with the idea that Jesus is God, and that Jesus had emotions, and thus we can say that God had emotions. So that's down to a kind of quirk in Christian doctrine, and the quirk is called the Communication of Idioms. So early on in the church, the Christian tradition decided that you could say God was born of the Virgin Mary, or God died on the cross, or that man Jesus created the world. So the things that you could say of Jesus, you could also say of God, and vice versa. But that's quite different from saying that God in God's self was born of the Virgin Mary, or God in God's self died on the cross, or indeed God in God's self suffered. So an analogy is sometimes made here to a CD and an amplifier. And a CD in itself can't play, a CD player in itself can't play sound, but you plug it into an amplifier and it can. And that seemed to be a bit like the divine nature. It can't suffer, but when plugged into the amplifier to the human nature, it kind of can suffer or can make sound. For many people in the turn of the 20th century, that wasn't really adequate enough. So it seemed to be a defect that God in God's self was an emotionless being. And that seemed to be a defect for a number of reasons. I think one motivation was to do with what people were suffering at the time. There was obviously the First World War, other things were going on, large amount of human suffering, and the idea of a cold, emotionless God struck people as kind of brutal. And perhaps the absence of saints and other religious figures who would suffer emphasised that. I think also there was a shift in the evaluation of human emotion. So Wim Wenders did a great film called Wings of Desire, and in that film there's an angel and he has this bodiless, emotionless, distant existence, and he trades it in to live this kind of bodily, vulnerable, emotional life. And when he swaps his existence for a human existence, to be relational, that's his, but vulnerable, it shifts from black and white to technicolor. It's this sense of an emotional life, a relational life is a richer life. And I think that shift in how we evaluate emotions is a fairly, arguably a recent emphasis. But I think theologians have sort of thought, well, if we think that emotions are really important to a rich life, a good life, then surely we want to attribute emotionality of God, because we want to say, we don't want to say that God is lacking these things that seem to be such important things in human existence.